Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and we're going to talk about the the new definition of the word nerd. All right, this is important. Thanks for discussing this with me. I'll see you in the comments below if you have any thoughts on this. So here we go. All right. So basically, every single 5th edition dungeon master in the world, and every single 5th edition dungeon player in the world, needs to acknowledge the new different definition of nerd, in my humble opinion. All right. So I'm going to give you the old definition of the word, in my humble opinion. I'm going to give you the new definition of the word, in my humble opinion. And the reason why we need to acknowledge this is nerd. I'll give you the big sweep, and then we'll kind of look at it in more granularity. The big sweep is nerd used to be a marginalized group. Now it's a privileged group. And guess what? There's a big issue in America right now. A lot of people saying, "Oh, you saying you a marginalized group? I think you a privileged group." And it's a huge discussion. Like, it's front lines of the culture wars, right? Which are bloodless wars that involve words, concepts, stances, right? And there's no actual real combat. It's just literally. It's the battlefield of words. And I thank the Lord. I'm very glad. I think in America, and everything I'm saying today, this is all American. This has nothing to do with internationals. Actually, I'd love to hear, if you're international and you have any kind of a equivalence, I'd love to hear what you think from an equivalency perspective. But but this is an American conversation, because this term is barely understood in America, and I think when other nations use it, I don't think the word's always used the same across different nations. I could be wrong about that, but everything I'm saying is U.S. specific. All right, so let's talk about the word nerd, right? Well, and actually, that idea that there's this big question, and we don't have mechanisms in America. We just don't have good mechanisms in America to go, oh my gosh, this marginalized group is now a fully privileged group, right? And actually, they have not only are they fully privileged, but they used to be a marginalized group, no question. But now their status has changed so much that they're marginalizing others, right? And I think that's exactly what's happening with nerds, all right? All right, so let's talk about this, all right? And by the way, the reason we're talking about this today is Critical Role. Critical Role says, we're nerds like you, right? And I'm like, you got Hollywood hair, Hollywood physique, Hollywood money. What are you talking about? In what way are you a nerd? Okay, right? And so let's talk about this. All right, so nerd. Let's talk about the original definition, okay? I think where this word really mattered was, and especially and we're talking about this from a Dungeons & Dragons perspective, right? And I'm saying Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition dungeon masters, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition dungeon players need to be concerned with this, because there's a history of the word nerd, and there's a present, of what's happening with nerd. And there's been a massive change, and we need to recognize this in America, because America has terrible mechanisms for recognizing when marginalized groups have become fully privileged groups. Right? We just don't have the mechanisms for this, and we get into huge debates and cultural wars over this, right? All right, so 1980, right? What does when somebody would say, "Hey, nerd," right? And what did they mean? What they meant was, you are a disempowered weirdo, right? And when they said it, what they meant was, when you walk home today from school, I'm going to knock your books out of your hand, and you're not going to be able to do anything about it, right? And no one's going to defend you, because you're a disempowered weirdo, right? That's what nerd meant in 1980. Okay, and here's the other one. Dungeons & Dragons was considered nerd stuff, and not stuff, but Sierra, Hank, Igloo, Terrier, right? Nerd stuff, right? I'm not going to say the word, but and when they would say, "Oh, you playing that D&D? You're playing that nerd stuff," right? And it was upsetting, right? And that was 1980, and there were real tears shed, right? Real loneliness connected, really being marginalized, okay? Boy, has that changed today, okay? You say, "Hey, nerd," right? It's completely different, right? So in 1980, you were saying, you're saying disempowered weirdo, and I'm going to knock your books out of your arm on the way home, and no one will defend you, and I will get no pushback from that because no one cares about you, right? Now you say, hey, nerd, in 2021, you know what that means? It means empowered eccentric, right? And you're like, hey, nerd, when you say that, you're like, you will probably be, you're thinking one of two things now. Different than what it was in the 1980s, right? Now it's like, you'll probably be my boss at some point in the future, or, oh, hey, you could definitely be someone I would date, right? Because as a nerd, you have a myopic focus on genre material, right? And that same myopic focus is now highly in demand by 100 different industries because you can take that same myopic focus and do knowledge work. And knowledge work is more powerful and more of a platform for success today than any other point in the world. And it is valued more. And there is more opportunity and more power and more success connected to your ability to myopically focus on small details of unusual things, right? So 1980, disempowered weirdo, nerd. 2021, empowered eccentric, nerd. Right? And why do we need to accept this new definition? Well, here's the problem. We don't want to be a group who is saying, I'm marginalized, as we literally have the power to marginalize others. And if you don't think we have the power to marginalize others, look at what's been being talked about massively in tabletop role-playing games, and definitely within the D&D context, is our dungeon masters gatekeeping, our dungeon players gatekeeping, and saying, you don't get to come into our game. We don't want to hear, we don't want to have people like you in our game. That's wrong, right? But we have the ability to do that. And look at Freaks and Geeks, right? The cool guy came to play D&D, right? Like Deborah Ann Wall plays Dungeons and Dragons today. Like she's literally straight, Hollywood goddess, comes straight out of True Blood, right? Like the people, Robin Williams and Stephen Colbert and Vin Diesel and Joe Manganiello, who's married to Sophia, I don't remember his wife's name, apologies. Sophia Vergara, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. But it's like the cool people are playing Dungeons and Dragons now, right? And it doesn't mean disempowered weirdo. It means empowered eccentric. And so we need to accept this because we need to stop acting like we're a marginalized group. And I know I think there's still a ton of Dungeons and Dragons people who are like, I'm a nerd and I pay this huge price for it. There's no price today, right? There's advantages today. Like if you are identified as a nerd, more increasingly, I think you are like your stake as a potential partner or spouse your value as a potential partner or spouse goes up. That was not the case in 1980, right? It meant you were generally, if you got this thing attached to you, you were going to be dateless, right? Let alone being somebody's spouse or partner, right? And that has dramatically changed. People are like, oh, nerd, money, right? Like, oh, nerd, position. Oh, nerd, high education. Oh, nerd, like increasingly. Like, I think the definition has changed, and we cannot be one of these groups who's like, I'm a marginalized group, as they're a fully privileged group who are marginalizing others, right? And the transition was not recognized because we are terrible in America at saying, oh, marginalized group, now you're a fully privileged group, you need to interact with the culture differently, right? And people making demands as they're literally sitting on top of a pile of powers, right? So it's really, really important. So I think the definition of nerd has fundamentally changed. And all 5th edition Dungeon Masters, all 5th edition Dungeon players, that's the tip of the spear when it comes to the tabletop role-playing game. They're the most, I think right now, they're the majority of players, and they're certainly the players that have that the rest of the world knows about, right? Like, if you play some of these indie games, culture isn't even aware, like they're not listening to you because they're not even aware of you as an identified aspect, right? So for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition players, Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Masters, it's really critical that we recognize this and we change our behavior. That's one of the biggest. I think that's the new, like, we are so blessed to live in this wonderful world where, a lot of issues have been swept away, right? But one of them is we now need to be hyper aware of what is our behavior, who is it offending, how do we change it, how do we make the world better for others, more comfortable for others, especially at the level that matters, right? Because we're no longer in a world where we're scraping for food, shelter, and clothing. Like, it's just, we have problems like gentrification. Like, we talk about problems like, oh my gosh, this city is getting rich. We're like, that's considered like a problem. We live in a fundamentally different world where we've really left Maslow's hierarchy far behind, right? Like, and of course there are still problems, but to pretend that we don't have infrastructures that are very much looking out to solve those problems literally every day just seems foolish. All that's my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you agree with me that the definition of nerd has very much changed? And if we're going to be honest about the difference between marginalization and privilege, we really need to recognize this and treat that word differently and treat our relationship with that word differently. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.